All right, hello everybody. I hope that wasn't too crazy for everyone that was in the last session. But this one we're going to go a little bit slower so we can really kind of just focus on really making craftful and artful delineations with the 12 parts. Um, just with a show of hands, I know there's only a few people in here now, but how many of you guys already know about the 12 parts? Not necessarily use, but like have an understanding maybe of a little bit of what they are. All right, cool. I'm seeing a few hands. So yeah, I mean, basically the thread that is at the top of the jumbotron has all of the diagrams and charts that we're going to be looking at today. So we'll just give another minute here to let people trickle in, and then we'll just get right started with it. But yeah, basically a quick little summary of how this is going to go. We're going to do an introduction to the philosophy and calculation of the 12 parts. And then we're going to move to a little bit of advice on delineation from some of the great minds of the tradition. And then we're going to do a step-by-step through the 12 stops on the journey and talk about some keywords for each one. Then we'll do chart examples, and then briefly, some other uses in other branches and questions. And also, I know this concept can be a little technical, so I'm actually going to invite people to raise their hand and ask the question along the way, because if you have it, most likely someone else does. And I just want to make sure, because we're really just focusing on the 12 parts, that everyone can walk away with an understanding of it and an idea of how to use these in delineating someone's natal chart. So I'm actually asking, if you do have a question, raise your hand. We'll get you to speak real quick and hopefully answer your question as quickly and easily as we can. So it's 4:01, so I'm going to get started. So yeah, the 12 parts, the Dodekatemoria, the dodecans, as I've kind of cheekily coined them for this talk, these are the fractal of the zodiac. So really, to understand the nature of any of the 12 signs, you have to understand that sign's unique perspective, that sign's unique relationship and interactions with all the other 12 signs. So it's really only this way that you can deeply know one sign, is really understanding its perspective in the entire journey from itself. And that's why, you can't really even get a full grasp of the zodiac unless you can really see it from the perspective of these 144 divisions, so that 12 by 12 division. So really, this is about not thinking about Virgo, for instance, as like just the sixth sign, but really that Virgo is the entire zodiac beginning from the sixth sign, and thinking about that understanding for all 12 signs. And the other thing I just want to say is that we don't have just 12 houses. We have 144 houses. What? Huh? What do you mean? Well, some of you might have heard of or be familiar with the idea of derived houses. That's also going to play a little bit in tandem with what we do today. The concepts of derived houses and 12 parts can be combined in a more complex synthesis that I'm not going to really touch on. It'll come up like once or twice with some of the examples, so planting a seed for that, but that's a whole other way they merge and work incredibly well together. So the 12 parts really just help expand our mind in the way that we approach a chart and really understand how all of these pieces are working together and kind of dancing around with each other in the chart. So a little bit with like the philosophy and the idea of the 12 parts, it really comes down to the idea of like a fractal, because that's how astrology works. Everything is a fractal. That's how all of the timing works. We know that, based off of the different rates of the planets, we segment them into different proportions and ratios, and that everything kind of interlocks with each other and stacks together like little, containers. It's the same thing with the 12 parts, because and the reason the 12 parts work so well as a division is because it's the most, I'm hesitant to use the word like divine, but like it's the most clear way you could really make a division of each sign. Is we have 12 signs, we're going to divide them each into 12, And the only kind of strange-ish thing at first maybe is just that we start by numbering and counting the 12 parts from the sign that we're in. So for instance, if you want to take a look at the first diagram that I have on the left-hand side of the first tweet that's attached, where it's just kind of looking at Virgo and Libra. When you look at Virgo from the first degree, those first 2.5 degrees are ruled by Virgo. So if you take these 30 degrees and you divide it by 12, we get 2.5 degree segments that are allotted to each of the 12 signs. So 12 times 2.5 is 30 whole degrees. So we split them up into 12, and then we just look and we start numbering them just one by one from the first sign. And this gives us a really orderly and neat division, because what this also is kind of fitting into in a way with that idea of the fractal is the idea of a decan, which is a 10-degree segment of a sign. So with any sign, we have 3 larger 10-degree segments called the decans, which, if you're familiar with like tarot or maybe astrological magic, the decans have a bunch of really interesting uses. Even in just natal delineation, they were used to kind of enhance and describe a little bit about the details of any planet's placement. Austin Coppock's done a bunch of awesome work with the decans. A lot of people have, but his work is really nice, 36 Faces. So what we're looking at in this diagram with Virgo and Libra, you can see on the left-hand side, we have those decans displayed, and there's two different symbols or rulerships that are given in each 10-degree segment. So the one closest to the signs with the planetary glyphs, those are the classic decans, beginning from Mars in the first decan of Aries and just going in that traditional order all the way around. So if you look in the big diagram with all 12 signs, you can see they start with Mars, and then they just go in that descending planetary order. It's the same order of the planetary hours. It's just the speeds of the planets going successively lower. So from Aries, we get Mars, then the Sun, and then Venus, and that just continues on straight through to Mercury, Moon, and then whenever we get the Moon, we just reset back to Saturn. So these are the traditional Chaldean decans. They go back to the Babylonians. And then the other system of decans here are the trigon decans, or the triplicity-based decans, or in Vedic astrology, they're called the Drekana. Basically, how these work is it's more about the element of the sign. So when considering division by 3, it should automatically maybe stimulate you to think a little bit about the elements, because we know that of the 12 signs, we have 4 groups of 3 elements each. So another way that they divided up these decans was by using this method of using the triplicities of the elements to label the first, second, and third decans as the first sign going in order that matches element of the sign you're in. So that will always be the sign itself. Then the middle decan by trigon or by triplicity or by element will be the next sign of that element. So with Aries, we see the first decan is Aries, the middle one is Leo, and the third is Sagittarius. So this will be the same going all the way around. For Taurus, we see the first one will be Taurus, the next Earth sign will be Virgo, and then the third will be Capricorn. And sometimes you see these listed with the planetary rulers instead of the signs, but I think it makes sense to just list the sign because you should know the ruler, but it's also a little bit more descriptive about, which sign is actually sitting there. So I just prefer to list them that way, but either is correct. And so now this is kind of where they work together, this idea of the 12 parts and the decans, because what we're seeing here is how we actually have 4 12th parts fit into one decan each. So, for instance, in Virgo, we see the first 10 degrees are going to have 4 2.5 degree segments. So we have Virgo, Libra, Scorpio, and Sagittarius, which all fit into the Virgo decan by triplicity, or the solar decan by the traditional method, or Chaldean method, not necessarily traditional. They both extend back. But I don't know. I pay attention to both. I think they both have an important qualifying effect on the sign. So what's happening here, though, is with having 4 12th parts in each decan, we get one of each element within each decan. So within each sign, we actually have one full elemental cycle that runs through each decan. And this is really interesting because we can sort of start to see how these layers are playing in with each other and starting to connect each other a little bit. So I really think this is one of the best ways you can start to understand how the 12 parts work, is really connecting it with the decan it's in and thinking a little bit about those four 12 parts as like kind of their own group that fit in the decan and act as their own elemental cycle. So for instance, when we look in the second decan of Virgo, it begins with Capricorn, and then we have Aquarius until the 15th degree, and then we have Pisces until the 17th and a half, and finally Aries until the 20th degree. And so these constitute sort of, like I said, their own elemental cycle. So we have earth, then air, and then water, and then fire. And so when you think about, each sign, what actually happens is it's very convenient, because if you look at the triplicity decan, it's always going to correspond with the first 12th part within that decan. So if we go back to the Capricorn one, we see that right before the Capricorn 12th part is Sagittarius, which makes up the last 2.5 degrees of the first decan. So we see the first 0 degrees of Virgo, that's the Virgo 12th part, and the Virgo decan. And then it remains the Virgo decan for 10 degrees, but then it cycles through the next 3 signs just in time that by the 10th degree, when we switch decan, it aligns with the same exact 12th part. So this is where we actually see the 12 parts as an extension of the trigon decans themselves. So they really are interacting and kind of harmonizing with each other. Now for fire signs, that elemental cycle within each decan is going to go from fire, earth, to air, to water. For earth signs within any decan, that order is going to go from earth to air to water and then to fire. For air signs, it'll go air to water to fire to earth. And then in water signs, it will go water to fire to earth to air. So that's this other way where now we see how these cycles are always repeating themselves and keeping themselves in their own kind of patterns and groups. And it all is stemming from, especially, the element of the sign, which gives us the triplicity decans, which from there lets us break down the 12 parts. So I'm going to pause there for a moment and just engage how everyone is understanding sort of what I'm talking about so far. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand and you can hop in and feel free to ask. Just going to give another moment. Sweet, I'm seeing thumbs up, so that's great. Yeah, and so basically, the other thing that I want to mention now that we've kind of covered that part with the calculation is there's been a little bit of discrepancy in the tradition about actually this concept. Because, and someone actually asked a question on this thread, or on another picture I posted of these like the other day, asking why does it switch at the end of Virgo from Leo into Libra? And it's a great question, because you'd think it would just, continue right through, but instead it has that little jump. And so with the 12th parts, we have to have that jump, because if we want to just have 2.5 degrees for each sign, it's going to leave off on the 12th sign from the one you begin with, which means when it crosses that boundary, it has to jump in between. Now, the interesting thing, though, is we did have a history of astrologers using the 13th harmonic, which would actually, it wouldn't be as even as of a division of the sign, because we're dividing 30 by 13. So mathematically, it's a little bit more uncomfortable. It's not as pretty as how the 12th parts fit in with the decans, like we've been talking about. But what it does do is it allows for that continuation. So for instance, Virgo, after those last degrees in Leo, it would go Virgo again, and then it would go into Libra. And they did this for a few reasons. Paul, when he exposes the Dodekatemoria, he introduces this method. He does not talk about the Dodekatemorias. I've been talking about them. He used solely the 13th harmonic. And so you might ask, like, well, why would they do that? Like, 13 isn't as even. But when you think about just the sun and moon transiting the signs all the time, what we actually have every month is, and we're about to have it tomorrow, when the moon goes into Libra while the sun is still in Libra, that will be the second time this month that the moon's been in Libra, because the moon was in Libra when the sun, or I'm sorry, I might be messing that up for this month. Maybe it was in Virgo, but that's not the point, because what happens is every month When the sun ingresses into a new sign, the moon's in a sign, and by the time the sun egresses into the next sign, the moon will be there again. So on both ends, the capstone, the bookends of each month, we have the moon being in the sign twice. So you can kind of see how naturally, just in the movements of the planets, having this division incorporate that beginning and ending on both sides, allowing for the continuation, it does make sense. And so that's the idea for the 13th harmonic. That's kind of all I wanted to say about it, because it is important here because it was a part of the tradition and they did use that. I haven't looked at it in a while. I used to for a while, and it works. But like I said, today we're just going to talk about this 12th harmonic. So I just wanted to make a little point about that before we go further. Now, the next piece with the 12th parts is really remembering that when we're about to start looking at these kind of second charts and looking at these other placements of the planets within each sign, we have to remember that we can't jump ship from the natal chart. That's like, I really want to stress that, because the natal chart is the foundation, always. The first harmonic, which is just your basic chart as it is the kind of supreme layer here. The 12th parts are what they sound like they are. You know, it's a subdivision. It's going to add influences and, you know, details to the picture. So you want to make sure that before you jump into really delineating these, that you already do have a pretty decent understanding of what's happening in the chart. You know, what's the ascendant ruler, what's ruling the lot of fortune, you know, where's the, you know, rulership of the angles and the, you know, planets in domicile. Like, you want to have all that already settled. Because if you jump right into the 12 parts without understanding what the planets are already and automatically doing and in charge of doing and responsible for doing, if you just jump into looking at a 12th part chart or Dodekatemoria chart, it's going to be a little ungrounded. So that's another base layer I want to just establish, that that has to be kind of clarified from the beginning, and then they would approach these. If you were in the last session that we were just doing on the Mercuranians, we talked about Rhetorius's kind of systematic exposition of reading a chart, and he says you look at the signs, the exaltations, the bounds, the decans, even the, you know, the faces of the decans, and a few other things, and then he lists the 12th part. So you have to understand what the basic rulerships are first, and then you look at these. Now, the other thing here is, like, the 12 parts are just so interesting because they really represent, they are like this vibrating piece of the sky that is like hidden behind the firmament. Like, it's there and it works so well when you can piece it together. So I don't want to like diminish and say, like, oh, it's minor, like it's, you have to look at it last, because it's really important. Like, it will change completely how a planet is working when they're configured in different ways. So I'm not trying to minimize their effect or the strength. It's just that there's a baseline that just has to be understood as really, you know, how their basic operation is going, from where the 12 parts can really actually significantly change or alter that direction. And we'll look at examples of how that happens. But I just want to say, like, the 12 parts, because it is so like based on having already looked at the chart, when you look at the 12 parts, I just really want to, like, if you walk away with this with anything, I don't want to be like, there's this one way to do it. It has to be interpreted like this, because I don't believe that's how the 12 parts work. The 12 parts are so mystical. They work in such a unique way that when you're examining it, it's just going to speak to you, okay? It's just going to vibrate. You're just going to see the patterns showing up. And if you already have an understanding of what the planets are doing, and you're trying to consult someone, or like you're looking at their chart and you see something in the 12 parts, it's just going to speak to you. You're just going to like see it happen. After you look at these enough, it's just going to feel natural, because you'll get a feel of how these things work, how the energy shifts. When you see things line up, you get like an empty house, right, in your birth chart, but then you have like 4 things sitting there in the 12th parts. It's like, it will totally change it. So the other thing I just want to mention, aside from knowing the base of the chart, is just being free with it and understanding that, like, we don't have a lot of surviving information on how to delineate these, mostly because you can't really make really hard and fast delineations about the 12 parts, because they're precedented upon the rulerships of the whole nativity. So as long as you understand how to do that, you can look at these and just know it's just going to speak to you. I really do mean that. So I just want to emphasize, like, you're the astrologer. Like, the art of the judgment is on your part as well. So once you approach a chart, knowing that foundation and knowing how to look at these, it's really going to be kind of natural to you. So just let it really speak to you. Okay, those were my points that I wanted to cover ahead of time. So now I am going to cover a few of the guidelines that the traditional astrologers did give us. So the first one I want to mention is Abu Mashar. Um, right at the beginning of nativities, he says very clearly, he lists like over 100 points. He tells you, you want to look at the 12 parts of all of the planets, all of the angles, all of the lots, all of the house cusps. He tells you all of these have to be ascertained to the degree in the root chart and the revolution. So he's telling you that every year of your life, you have to pay attention to what they're doing in your chart, but also how they're changing every year. So we're not even going to get into revolution charts, but the idea is that all of the factors are on the table to be looking at the 12th part of lots, angles, even house cusps. And he also mentions that you can direct them too. So, yes, with the 12th part of your sun, you could do timing techniques from that position. Or the 12th part of your lot of fortune, you could do timing techniques from that degree or by whole sign if you want to perfect. Those places are important enough that for the most important places in the chart, you'll likely get good results doing timing techniques from their 12 parts. Now, with the houses, or I'm sorry, I'm not going to go there yet. We're going to talk about mashallah. Mashallah gives us a few points with looking at the 12 parts. He says you want to look at the 12th part of the sun to see information about the father, and the 12th part of the moon to see the information or condition of the mother. And this is interesting because in the Vedic tradition, I won't speak too extensively about that because I'm by no means a scholar of the Vedic tradition. John here is though, so if you want to hop in and um, show me what I should be talking about here, let me know. But there is an emphasis, I believe, on like familial connections or like ancestral like karmic things that show up with the 12 parts, I believe. So I could be wrong, but I believe there's some relation to that that's interesting to note, that we have the medieval astrologer who's talking about how the 12 parts of these important planets, the sun and moon, are going to kind of tell you a little bit about your mother and father. At least we have that from many sources, but mashallah says it really clearly. Now they also talk about if you have the sun or the moon's 12th part move into your 12th house. So say your ascendant is Cancer. If the 12th part of your sun or moon is in Gemini, it's indicating there, his quote is, it indicates the ignobility and greed of the father or mother is most certainly revealed. So if you have one of your lights moving into the 12th house, it could indicate something about a maybe difficult connection or relationship or experience that you had with one of your parents. That was sort of one of the guidelines that he gave. Mashallah also talked about looking at the 12th part of Mercury, Venus, and Mars. Now, those three planets were given an interesting role in medieval astrology, and even maybe further back to Rhetorius, who I think talked about this, where the planets of figuring out someone's career or works or actions, they said look at Mercury, Venus, and Mars to discover kind of like what they do. So he would say, look at the 12th part of these three for more details on someone's career or their job or their works. And the last part, mashallah, talks about is actually a mutual reception by 12th part. And this is kind of interesting. Basically looking at the chart and seeing if you have planets like in aversion, or maybe a planet, is ruled by another planet, but, they don't see each other. If you can get their 12th parts to witness each other, that will, it really impact the situation. And also that, particularly if it's a mutual reception. So say you have like the 12th part of your Venus in Gemini and the 12th part of your Mercury in Libra, normally that couldn't happen because Mercury and Venus can't be that far apart from each other because they have to be next to the sun. So maybe they're in aversion. Say your Venus is natally in Gemini and Mercury's in Cancer, but maybe their 12th parts move around a bit, and those signs are also in Tisha, but I shouldn't have even said that. Just don't worry about that. Pretend they're in aversion. But by their 12 parts, maybe they move into like an exact trine or it's a mutual reception or something. Basically, he's just talking about looking at the planets to see how maybe if they're not normally communicating, if their 12 parts are, that changes everything. That allows them to communicate, exchange their house topics, and be able to reciprocate their significations with each other. So that was mashallah. And then Rhetorius gives us a few other points. He says, the 12 parts of the lights in the first house show well-born parents. He also says that if you have the 12th part of your malefics falling into the signs where your sun or moon or ascendant or midheaven are, that this is bad. He just says this, very unfortunate. I'm not going to say like that's a horrible thing, because it's probably common that maybe you have one of those things happen where maybe Mars falls into your first house, or Saturn falls into the sign where your sun or moon is. And that is an unfortunate, maybe, sort of debilitation that the planet the planet has to endure. He, in Rhetorius, I'll just read a little bit. On page 111 of Holden's translation, he gives a bunch of really great delineations for how the malefics affect planets in their 12 parts. He says, if the Dodekatemorian of Saturn and the Dodekatemorian of Mars falls into the place of the moon or sun, it's not good. But if their Dodekatemoria fall in their own trines, it makes moderately good things. Now, that means, for instance, if you have Mars at 10 to 12.5 degrees of a sign, so earlier, if you want to look at that diagram again, if it's in one of those little places that makes the trine aspect from the sign, that's a good thing. And we'll get back to this once we talk about those 12 steps and the keywords for each one. But he's saying if the malefics fall into trine, that's a good thing. So normally with the malefics, we think, they're a little harmful. If they happen to be at 10 to 12.5 degrees, or 20 to 22.5 degrees of a sign, it's very beneficial for their signification. So check if you have a malefic planet whose 12th part is in those degree segments, in which case it is acting a little more efficiently and positively. If it falls into the ascending sign, the malefics, they will be grieved because of children, and they'll be sickly. If into the descendant, they will experience dangers from crises and falls and diseases of the eye. And if onto the MC, they have hindrances to their reputations. But if into the IMC, they are troubled by hidden places. And if the Dodekatemoria of Mars, and the Dodekatemoria of Mars makes similar things. If Saturn falls into the place of Jupiter, he will have controversy with the ruler. But if it falls into that of Mars, he will be involved in many legal judgments. If that into Mercury, he will be grieved over children and brothers. And if that onto Venus, he will be grieved over by a woman. And if that onto the Sun, it harms the paternal wealth or does some evil to the father himself. So he keeps going on. He gives lots of delineations for understanding what that effect is if you have a malefic falling onto the same sign as one of your other planets. And lastly, like mashallah, Rhetorius mentions the mutual reception by the 12 parts. But he highlights a very interesting thing, and I just want to make this comment so all of you guys can look out for that, and if it happens so for you in your chart. But he talks a lot about when Mars and Venus start interacting in a significant way in the 12 parts, whether they move into an exact aspect, or if they, the 12th part of Venus aspects like the natal Mars, or if they're conjunct in the 12 parts, or even if they have a mutual reception of some sort. He just says if Mars and Venus are interacting with each other in the 12 parts, it makes drunkards. He gives it a very difficult exposition, but he says it makes drunkards, effeminates, bisexuals. He kind of gives these really negative significations, or he uses negative words to describe, now what is not as, socially unacceptable. But, if some of you have, maybe are somewhere on the LGBTQ, maybe you could see if something with your Mars and Venus are happening in the 12 parts significant, like I talked about, that might express something having to do with an unusual expression of your sexuality, is something that he talks about here. And like I said, unfortunately, he uses not the greatest words to talk about that, but that is what he's saying nonetheless. So you want to look at, where the 12 parts of your sun and moon are. These are the places where you're responsible for engaging with your vital energy and expressing your character to fulfill your life purpose. So these are sensitive places of health, physical and mental well-being especially. If you have hindered placements with the lights, it can, damage actually your eyesight, because the sun and moon have to do with your eyes. But it can also be a little bit of a damage to the vital life force within the lights. Now look at the 12 parts of Venus and Jupiter. These are the benefic planets. Wherever they land, these places get extra beneficial support, especially if they fall by the degree into close aspect with something else in your chart. Even if it's square opposition, that's all right. The benefics are going to kind of generally be acting to support that place. I'll say unless everything is wrong with the planet in the chart, then in the first harmonic, just in the regular chart, then maybe not. But these points basically are going to help out those other places they're contacting. Now with the malefics, Mars and Saturn, wherever they land, whatever house they land in, these are places that get some extra challenges or obstacles. Once again, especially when they come into close contact with a natal planet or point. So that kind of branches off the end of this segment on reading through some of the traditional delineations. Does anyone have any questions before we talk a little bit about each of these 12 steps and go over some keywords? Yeah, so before I move on, does anyone have any questions about those themes I just mentioned? No? Good. If not, please feel free to write something in the comments. You can DM me, you can tap the little comment on the bottom hand screen, and I will have plenty of time to make sure that later I will respond to any of your questions. So you can also totally feel free to write me something later. So now, talking a little bit about what these 12 parts kind of each indicate. So they each have sort of their own step along the way. Now, I'm going to start talking off a little bit about the decans and what it means if you have a planet in the first, second, or third decan. Because those are the three... Oh, I'm sorry, we have a request. They are connecting. Hello, Celestial House? Oh, where did they go? Celestial House, did you want to speak? I think you jumped back down to a listener, but if you'd like to ask, I can bring you on again. Yeah, I'm not sure what happened, but if you want to speak, just request again. Oh yeah, okay. Here, hey, how's it going?
Actually 4:30 here in Philippines. So I wanted to ask a question regarding the interaction between the sun and the moon as they go through the 12 parts. So you mentioned earlier like it was it seemed to me like it was more like a sandwich, or was it like a cyclical, like you said that the sun would go back to that particular place in the chart.
Yeah, so basically, with the 13th harmonic, which was that kind of variation of this calculation, it
Mm-hmm.
was a little bit more representative of, what we see in the sky because it takes a little
Mm-hmm.
bit longer than one lunar cycle for the sun to move through a sign. What happens is, say the sun is at 0 degrees of, Scorpio and the moon is in Libra,
Mm-hmm.
then when the sun is at 29 degrees at the end of the month, that's actually a little bit longer than it takes for the moon to do one revolution. So the moon will be back in Libra at the end of the month. So the 13th harmonic allows for that connection between all the signs without having to have the little jump. But it
Mm-hmm.
also is a little bit more natural to mirroring what we see with like the lunar transits every month.
So it's like it's fluid, right? Like.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, there's a certain fluidity with it that's kind of nice. It's more continuous. And so, like I said, I've looked at them and they do work. It's kind of, it's a slightly different harmonic, so it's a little bit different. But yeah, we're mostly just going to look at these 12 parts today.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'm glad that clarified it. Thank you for asking the question. So yeah, so with the planets in the decans, the first decan is the first elemental cycle. So if you look at the diagram with the decans and 12 parts together, what happens in the first decan of a sign is a planet is going to move. One second. A planet's going to move from the co-presence in that sign all the way up until the very beginning of the trine. So what that is, the first four signs we have a planet being co-present, and then in aversion. In this case, in the Virgo and Libra diagram, I also added a contra antitia just because that is true. There is still a relationship between them. So there will be like 1 degree when a planet in like this Virgo Libra 12th part will actually be contra antitia to itself, and that's also a really interesting phenomena that you can look out for. But not all cases will be contra antitia. So this will mostly just be aversion. Then in the Virgo Scorpio, in Virgo Sagittarius will be square. So that's the first elemental cycle. So up until then, the planet itself in Virgo is superior to its 12th part. So that means it's in an earlier position in the zodiac than its 12th part. So that means that the planet itself is still having the force and the momentum behind that relationship to its 12th part. Now, what happens is as a planet moves through the degrees and moves to further 12th parts, the planet sort of like gains more evolution in a way. It gains more experience through the signs. It gains more, degrees. And so what happens is in the second decan, when it makes the opposition exactly at 15 degrees and enters the sign of opposition, that sort of begins the second phase where by the third decan, the 12th part becomes superior to the planet's placement. So what that means is if you look at, like, say your sun is at 25 degrees of Virgo. So if you go and find 25 Virgo, you see that it's in the 12th part is Cancer. But when we look at a chart, we know Cancer would be superior to Virgo. Within that sextile, the Cancer placement would be superior. It's ahead of it. It's like initiating the aspect. So with planets in the third decan, what you get finally is the 12th part actually having the superior position over the initial placement. And what that brings is sort of a different kind of delineation, because I'll just kind of give them out now. A planet in the first decan, this is really about trying and testing, beginning and exploring something. Then by the second decan, that's sort of where this beginner's luck phase turns into that enduring effort, encountering the road, breaking obstacles at the opposition, breaking the old pattern, or shattering the initial circumstances. So that by the third elemental cycle, by the third decan of a sign, that is when you have the mastery, the sharing of knowledge and information. The 12th part becomes superior to the planet. So all of that gained past experience becomes used to help ease along the journey ahead in a way. Now, that's a very general statement because you have to consider the condition and dignity of the planet in that sign. Just because it's maybe in the third decan, which might give it that superiority, maybe it's traversing the sign of its fall, right? So you have to maybe think about that too. It's not as blanketly overt as just saying it becomes great in the third decan, but that's the idea. Now, with these 12 divisions, we're going to go through them a little quickly. So hopefully you guys can listen back to the recording if you want to take notes on this, but I'm going to go through them a little fast. The first 12th part is the helm. Okay, so we're going to think of it like a derived house. So the first place is Virgo, Virgo. So it's in the same house as what it is in the natal chart. So it's still at home, right? It's not outside of its own home yet. It's powerful in its intentions. Then by the second 12th part, would be the second house, or the gate of Hades. This is an aversion. So it's actively sustaining and supporting its own actions, right? Because the second house is where we find our support. It's the sign that's rising up after the first house. So it's what supports the first house. So it's kind of the first setting out. You're not really thinking about being, away from home yet. Then by the third 12th part, we get to the sextile. This is from 5 to 7.5 degrees. This would be like the house of the goddess, the third house. So this is kind of your first look back at home, being in the moon goddess, longing for something old, something familiar, maybe being in, kind of like familiar territory still. You're not too far away from your home yet. These planets are really leveraging their social skills to try and get by and manifest what they're doing in the radical house. Now, by the fourth 12th part, we get to the square, which is going to be from 7.5 to 10 degrees. And so this is the subterranean. This is the kind of first obstacle that's sort of an inner obstacle. It's not as like overt as the opposition, for instance, which we'll get to in a moment. This is really like encountering, the subterranean, having to face the heart or depth of a matter, maybe being invisible or experiencing the death or loss of that thing. Now, then we get to 10 degrees to 12.5, which is the fifth sign, or the trine, and this is the house of good fortune, derived from the natal place. So this is where we change decan here. There's a big shift in the planet's journey at this point. The planet now is finding more ease in expressing its significations more readily, with more beneficial outcomes. It's a lot more focused on production and growth in this segment. Now, in the sixth, 12th part, we get to the aversion again. And will always be from 12.5 to 15. This is a really interesting range because, we know this would be the house of bad fortune, the sixth house. This is sort of a blind spot of conflict. It's sort of like a little bit infectious, where it's being challenged to find structure. It's being challenged against dissolution and disintegration, right? We know the sixth house is the house of like literally the disintegration of the body. So with planets in this degree, there's that challenge of sustaining past or really overcoming, force that's also simultaneously a little bit of a blind spot because you can't look directly at it. With the seventh sign now, we move to the opposition, 15 to 17 and a half degrees. I want to highlight this for one really particular reason, and that's because the opposition will always be a planet, in detriment, essentially. It's like that's that position that is working against itself. Okay, the opposition is this conflict of desire being split in two directions, a crossroads, right? They called it the detriment, the exile. When a planet's in the opposition, it's encountering a unique kind of challenge where it's really at this point set out on, it's not like the final battle yet. That's like a little bit later on. This point is about having something really overcoming. I'm sorry, where did my thing just went out? But basically, yeah, the opposition, it's going to present the kind of most trying obstacle the planet is going to face. And so for a planet, it's in its own sign, if it's ever at 15 degrees in its own sign, then it literally enters detriment. So especially for planets that you have in their own signs, but at 15 degrees, it's actually a sort of debilitation because it's being opposed by its 12th part and therefore being in its detriment. Now with 8, we move into the idle place, the 8th house, or it's another place of aversion. This is going to be from that kind of funky range from 17 and a half to 20 degrees. And this is sort of like a loss of self-empowerment, feeling a little bit cheated or disillusioned. Also, a fall from grace is a key word that I see come up a lot with this kind of degree. After that, we move and we change decan again. So now we move to the trine. This would be the 9th house, the house of God. This is from 20 to 22 and a half degrees of a sign. We're changing decan, so now it's becoming superior by aspect. And this is sort of that like kind of moment of enlightenment, personal gnosis. All the lessons and intuition and direct experience you have are sort of victorious over the thoughts and feelings and anxieties of the beginner's mindset, which predominate sort of earlier on. Then we move into the 10th sign. So this is the superior square. This is a really important 12th part if you have planets here, because the planet dominates itself. It moves to the 10th sign from where it is in the natal chart. This is the midheaven, right? So the planet is now achieving like prominence and visibility for its topic. It is inspirational action. It's a test of strength to really establish an enduring legacy. Now, with the 11th, we move to the last sextile from 25 to 27 and a half. And this is like the homecoming, right? It's the assistance, the celebration. All your skillful assets and allies are working with the planet. And finally, we get to 27 and a half to 30, which is the final aversion, the house of bad spirit. It's the final rest, that urge to, push onward, being on the brink of major change, maybe feeling dissatisfied, about to totally, experience a spiritual crisis that inspires that major change that comes with the sign change. So, okay, that was my really quick run through of the 12 parts. I'm sorry that this is running so fast. I would love to continue the discussion about some of these things with you guys later on, but I have to jump into the example charts. So, right underneath the diagrams, we have two charts. The first one is of Kim Kardashian. So today is Kim's birthday, so I thought it was kind of apt. So some of you might already be familiar with her chart, but basically what we're going to look at here is a few different things. If you look at the first chart on the left, this is just her natal chart. Now, if you zoom in really closely on the outermost edge of the wheel, you can see the 12 parts are being displayed. AstroSeek does this very beautifully. This is from their website. I will add a link to that website right on this thread, so you guys can go and take a look at that if you haven't gotten a calculation of this in your chart before. And then, so that has the 12 parts displayed with the natal chart. Then next to that, that chart that you see right to the right, the inner planets are the same natal positions as you see in the chart to the left, and the outer placements are the 12 parts. So what you're actually seeing is, a planet can fall within any range of those 2.5 degrees of its 12th part. So it is projected to and falls on an equal amount through of that sign. So if you imagine looking at, for instance, Kim's sun at 28 Libra, if you zoom in and look at the tiny sliver of Virgo that it falls into in the first chart, you see it's kind of just about 1/3 of the way through the sign. Then if you go to the next chart, you can go up and look at Virgo and see that it just barely has entered, like 11 degrees just after that transition into the next decan. So how this second chart you're looking at works is projecting all of those natal degrees exactly to the degree, proportionately where they fall in the 12th part, we project that same amount outward, and cast that planet to land at that degree in this 12th part chart. Okay, so some things about this chart. The 12th part of the ascendant is in Taurus. It lands exactly on her natal lot of fortune. Now, think about Kim, right? She's like one of the richest people in the planet. The 12th part lands exactly on the lot of fortune, right? So this is indicating, her, maybe mindset or her life is somehow characterized by her acquisition. It's so clear right there. And this is also an interesting thing you guys want to look out for, because this is what's called like it's sort of a confirmation of predomination. Like basically, if you've heard of using the fortune houses before, using the derived houses from the lot of fortune, if you ever have the 12th part of the ascendant land in the same sign as the lot of fortune in your chart, that is like, okay, confirmed. You can definitely use that sign as a place to do derived houses from and make accurate delineations about their chart. So if you ever see the 12th part of the ascendant land with the lot of fortune, definitely look at those derived houses because they're going to be resonating. Now, the lord of this ascendant is Venus. And we see in the 12th parts, Venus is in Aries. And that's going to be the 12th sign from the ascendant. So just so you know, from now on, I am going to be considering the derived houses from Taurus. So Taurus is now house 1. That means Aries is now the 12th house. And the other thing I want to point out is if you look in her natal chart, look at her sun. Her sun is in the 12th part. It's in that final 12th part. Look at her moon in Pisces. It's also in the final 12th part. It's in Pisces Aquarius. She has another planet that does that. She has Jupiter in the final 12th part of Virgo, in Virgo Leo. So this is all these indicators of these planets moving into the 12th sign from where they are, particularly the fact that Venus of the ascendant and then moves into Aries. Kim is currently working for advocating for criminal justice and prison reform. As someone who maybe despite her own fame and notoriety may feel like imprisoned by her fame and wealth in a way. So it's interesting to see all these 12th house themes show up. And then we see the MC, the 12th part of the MC land in Leo, right with Jupiter in the south node, right? So this is also the 4th sign from the 12th part of the ascendant in Taurus. So Leo's 4th from Taurus. So her midheaven, what she's known for is the family, the home life. And think about, Jupiter and Leo, it's a very, that's also Jupiter. He's in his own decan there. It's this very, magnanimous, exuberant, ostentatious display of wealth that they're becoming known for, specifically related to her family, because it's the 4th derived house. There's also an exact nodal reversal. So the nodes, this is another thing to look for. When the nodes are at 15 degrees, because what happens is you get a nodal reversal. From that 15 to 17 and a half, the nodes are going to be in the opposite signs. And what this does in someone's chart is it really highlights the axis that they're on. So for instance, in this chart, we see that the nodes are, falling in the Leo Aquarius. And once again, this is the 4th and 10th house. So we're seeing somehow there's this huge emphasis and connection on the home and her work, her family and her career and her reputation. Now the next thing here, Mercury is ruling her 10th house in her natal chart. It's Virgo. Now Mercury is peregrine in Scorpio in the 12th house. You can see him there in the natal chart in the 12th. Now Mercury's 12th part, look at that, moves into Gemini. An angular house, he gains a lot of strength, and he gains the dignity of domicile, which is the most powerful. And think about this. What is she known for, right? She's known for her crazy, scandalous marriages, and also particularly to Kanye West, who is a Gemini himself. And he trines that 11th house sun. You can see that beautiful trine right between the Mercury and Sun, showing that this, status and eminence she has in her career is associated with this partnership, right? It's like we see how Mercury is the ruler of the midheaven, even though it's just sitting in the 12th, it's also sitting in Gemini in the 7th house, right? So normally we would look at this and say, oh, well, that's not boding well for her 7th or 10th house. Mercury's kind of peregrine in Scorpio. He can't witness Gemini or the 7th house. And, those are true in some ways. She's had several unsuccessful marriages. But we see how there's this huge promise of these really significant relationships of particular Gemini kind of quality coming into her life. Now, I want to move back to Taurus being the ascendant, because we looked at Venus, who's the domicile lord, but you also always want to look at the exaltation lord of the sign. So the exaltation lord of Taurus is the moon. So the moon also rules Cancer. And if you think about where Cancer is from Taurus, it's the third sign, which is the house of siblings. So the moon, the 12th part, is in Aquarius, you can see. That is the 10th sign from Taurus. So the moon being in the 10th is the exaltation lord of the third and the domicile lord of, the exaltation lord of the first house, Taurus, and the domicile lord of the third house, Cancer. So it's bringing up to the highest prominence and eminence Kim's own rising station, right, is the exaltation lord of the first house, but also the presence of her siblings related to her career, because the moon is the ruler of the third house from Taurus in the 10th house from Taurus. So it's pulling up and sucking up the themes of the first and the third right into the 10th house. And she's literally known for working with her siblings, their show, their shops. They opened the Dash stores together. They've been working together in a high amount of reputation for years. And the other interesting thing here is the show, the Keeping Up with the Kardashians, actually began in an Aquarius perfection year. So the year that all these planets in the 12 parts were activated by the perfection of her ascendant, it all landed in an Aquarius year. So, and there's a few ways you can see that happening with Saturn, but also it's like we see this so clearly in the 12 parts coming to life and how that all came into effect that year. Now Saturn, his 12th part, if you want to take a look at her natal 12th house of Scorpio, Saturn lands exactly conjunct the 12th part of the descendant. And that's also exactly in opposition to her lot of fortune. So you can see this whole resonant structure lining up like around 15 Taurus and 15 Scorpio in her natal 6th and 12th houses, or her derived 1st and 7th. So what we're seeing here is her, she's known for these scandalous, powerful, destructive, and now inimical relationships with partners that have been in the past, and I predict will probably continue to be in the future, a threat to her fortune and her wealth. Because the Saturn is exactly opposing the lot of fortune with the descendant, is showing somehow there's a huge financial suck-up situation that's happened in relationship to her partnerships, and that's already been, she's been dealing with that, especially since her divorce with Kanye West, the inheritance and her kids and everything. So it's like you see how much stress is put into the situation because of Saturn's 12th part. And also the final thing with her chart that I have here is, the sun is her sun moves into the 12th house. I'm sorry, the 10th house, because in Libra, it's in that final 12th part of Libra Virgo, and that places its 12th part in the 10th house. And we get that delineation from Mashallah that it indicates the prominent station of the father. And her father, Robert Kardashian, was a famous American attorney, well known and associated with the whole O.J. Simpson case. So it's interesting that we see his delineation also come into play with the 12th part of her sun in the 10th house, because that's indicating not only her own prominent station as an individual, but also specifically about her father. So that's Kim. There are a few other things, but we have to move on, unfortunately. So we're going to talk a little bit about the next chart, who's a completely different individual. This is the chart of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was one of the presidents of the United States. So same thing here on the left, you have his normal natal chart. You can zoom in and see which 12th part they fall in. And then on the left, you're getting those projected placements interacting with the natal chart. So the 12th part of his ascendant falls into Gemini, into the 10th house, with the powerful sun also falling into the 10th house. So look at that. This person was the president. We see the complete rise of their prominence and authority into the world, into visibility, and to, their height of their reputation, with the sun conjoining the ascended by 12th part up in the 10th house. Now the 12th part of his midheaven, if you can find Aquarius, lands right on his Mercury. Now Mercury rules his natal ascendant and his natal midheaven. So what's that indicating? This person is becoming extremely prominent and well known for literally being a prominent individual, being literally the president of a country. We see the 12th part of the midheaven landing right on the ascendant ruler and MC ruler, indicating he himself is known for his work because he's a immensely well-known and respected ruler himself, known by the masses. I see here Althea has a question. It's still connecting. Yeah, Althea, what's going on? How are you doing? Can you hear me, Althea? Okay. I'm gonna hold off on that for now. We can maybe revisit that later because we just have a few minutes left. Now, Mercury is his ascendant ruler and the midheaven ruler. So we want to find what Mercury's 12th part is doing. And look at it. It's sitting in detriment in Sagittarius in the fourth house natally, but it's the seventh house from the derived houses of the 12th parts. And this is really important because what we see happening with this Mercury creates a whole really clear picture of what FDR went through. So he's in detriment, opposing Mars to the degree. You see that powerful red line? The 12th part of the Mercury sits exactly opposite to his natal Mars in the 10th house. Now, FDR was diagnosed with polio, which is a crippling illness that never allowed him to walk in the year 1921. And so what we see here is Mercury in Sagittarius, which rules the thighs and the legs, in detriment as his ascendant ruler. So this planet has to indicate his health, his body, his well-being, being maltreated by Mars to the degree. And in addition, he was diagnosed with polio in the year of his ascendant perfecting to the sign of Sagittarius. So if you normally look at this and you'd say, okay, well, it was a Jupiter year. He's got, Jupiter in Taurus in the ninth house. Jupiter isn't ruling his sixth house or his 12th house or, kind of a malefic place. But look at Jupiter's 12th part. Jupiter's 12th part is in Scorpio, which is the derived sixth house from the 12th part of the ascendant in Gemini. So when Jupiter was activated, when Sagittarius was activated, we had the immediate activation of the maltreatment of his ascendant ruler Mercury opposing Mars, and also that activation of Jupiter being in the derived sixth house from Gemini. And all this happened in that Sagittarius year. Now, the other thing with the Mercury story here is FDR's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, was heartbroken when she discovered his love letters to Eleanor's assistant, Lucy Mercer, with whom he had an affair. So he also had another extended affair with another secretary. He had a history of having women kind of in and out of his office, and you can see how this maltreatment as his ascendant ruler also speaks to the difficulties that he experienced in his relationships and with infidelity in his affairs as well, being a major first house, seventh house theme kind of coming up here. The lies, the deceit, Mars and Gemini, it's like Mercury's in detriment. And the one other piece is Mercury actually is conjoined within a degree or two to the syzygy, is that kind of circular moon-looking degree. And the syzygy degree is important for giving us information about our health and our vitality. So you see that Mercury is conjoined to this, in a really not good position, right with a point that's important for holding our health and our vital life force. So you can see how that just destroyed his whole lower body the year that Sagittarius perfection happened. Now, Saturn's 12th part conjoins the moon in Cancer. So you can see in Cancer, he has Saturn in the same sign as the moon. And Eleanor struggled with FDR at first because he let his mother have such a tight grip and restriction on his finances. And even when Eleanor offered to divorce him after she discovered his affair, FDR's mother prohibited the divorce, threatening to cut FDR off from his entire inheritance if he followed through with it. So that Saturn in Cancer is in the second house derived from Gemini, which means that we literally see, the moon is the significator of his mother in that second derived house of his finances, with Saturn sitting there as this complete opposition and block that didn't allow him to, listen to her otherwise. It's this extremely restrictive force, literally indicating how the mother was controlling the finances. The other piece with that is, a malefic conjoining a luminary is a threat to the vital life force. Rhetorius says the delineation of Saturn moving onto the moon is an indication for that. The 12th part of the moon moves into Virgo in the first house. Rhetorius says that gives a close connection to the mother and also the well-born status of the parents, which is true. His parents were socialites. They were scholars. He studied with his father, who was like a well-known socialite in New England, and his mother as well. So we see that played into the role with his both of his parents. And let's see here. Mars moves into the 11th sign from the 10th house. So Mars's 12th part is in Aries. And this is really interesting because we have a planet moving into its own domicile. And the 11th from the 10th would be the allies of the career. And he literally he was a naval secretary. He led the entire country through 4 terms of presidency through World War I and World War II. He like literally was able to command an entire army. And you can see how literally Mars moving into its own domicile in the 11th, from the 10th house. It's like the support of the allies and the army from career. And I have more notes about all this, but it's almost time to go. So I have to respect the other speakers. So thank you guys so much for coming. I wish we had more time to talk about all this. Please message me with any other questions you have. I wish we could keep going, but I'm going to have to sign off. So thank you all so much for coming. I hope this was an exciting introduction to using the 12th parts. And I hope you guys have an amazing rest of your day at all the other lectures you guys are going to. And like I said, feel free to message me with any questions. Thank you guys so much. All right. Bye, everyone.